Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining us today for this program, and a special welcome also to those who are watching this program live online. I'd like to begin by thanking also two special guests who honor us with their presence. His Excellency Carlos dos Santos, the Ambassador of Mozambique here in Washington, and His Excellency Seydou Kaboré, the Ambassador of Burkina Faso. My name is Peter Pham, and I'm the Vice President for Research and Regional Initiatives here at the Atlantic Council, as well as Director of the Council's Africa Program. I'm delighted that we'll be collaborating with the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change for today's event, which concurrently serves as the U.S. launch for their new report, The Jobs Gap, Making Inclusive Growth Work in Africa. We hope this is but the first of many fruitful collaborations between our two organizations. Before we begin, permit me to say a few words about the Africa Center. Founded in 2009, the Africa Center's mission is to promote dynamic geopolitical partnerships with African states and to shape U.S. and European policy priorities to strengthen security and promote economic growth and prosperity on the continent. Today's event reflects our increasing focus on the economic transformations taking place across Africa, but of course not without their challenges. Our panel today will look at one of those obstacles, the jobs gap, in detail. In recent years, the excitement of the Africa Rising narrative and some very real African economic success stories has given way to the reality of some of the continent's daunting economic challenges. On top of that economic reality is a demographic challenge. By 2040, the continent will be home to more than 2 billion people, and Africa's labor market is expected to grow to 1.1 billion, surpassing Asia's. Unfortunately, the continent's official unemployment rate stubbornly hovers around 7.5, well above the global average, and its job creation trajectory is insufficient to meet the demands of a burgeoning population. As a result, African governments are at a crossroads. Sound policy decisions made now can promote inclusive development and mobilize millions into African labor markets. To discuss all this and more, we have a top-notch panel this afternoon, including several individuals who deserve some special thanks for having traveled extra long distances to be here. Today's panel will be moderated by Aubrey Hruby, a senior fellow with the Africa Center. Over her career advising Fortune 500 companies and U.S. and non-U.S. government agencies on how best to invest in Africa, Aubrey has helped to facilitate more than $2 billion in investment and capital flows to the continent, and we're delighted to have her as part of our team anchoring our work on economic prosperity in Africa. Ms. Anabel González is former Minister of Trade of the Republic of Costa Rica. She's a Senior Director of the Trade and Competitiveness Global Practice at the World Bank, where she leads the design and implementation of the bank's global and country agenda in areas of trade and investment. Ms. Helen Hai is the founder of Made in Africa Initiative and a UNIDO Goodwill Ambassador for Industrialization in Africa. Helen advises several African governments on investment promotion, industrialization strategies, and how best to promote economic growth and create jobs across the continent. Finally, Mr. Jonathan Said is an author of this report and is head of the Inclusive Growth and Private Sector Development Practice at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Jonathan manages multiple advisors working on economic transformation across 5 African countries. Previous to assuming his current portfolio, Jonathan served as the Tony Blair Organization's country manager in Liberia, where he managed a team of 7 advisors working on agricultural transformation, education, and strengthening the center of government's capabilities. The latter a Herculean task, as I should know, having once written a book entitled Liberia, Portrait of a Failed State. Finally, I'd like to thank DevEx, our partner, for partnering with us for this important and timely conversation. I encourage everyone in the audience and those watching online to read the op-ed co-authored by Aubrey and Jonathan that ran earlier today on DevEx's website. You can also find copies outside the event. Now to present his report, after which our panelists will join him in a broader discussion, let me turn things over to Jonathan. So Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pham, and thank you to Aubrey and the team at Atlantic Council for hosting us today and co-organizing this event with us. And thank you very much to Anabel and to Helen for accepting our invite to be here, and for everyone today for making the effort to come along. Before I jump into the report, just a few words. You might be wondering about what is it exactly that the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change does. Effectively, as it says there, we're trying to contribute towards making globalization work for the many and not just for the few. And we try to do that with 4 strands of work. One is about developing and emerging countries and really helping governments, in particular in those countries, to implement their own agendas, their own development agendas. And we do this both through the leader-to-leader support by Tony Blair and the head of state, but also by embedding teams of advisors that work on a day-to-day basis in the ministries, in the agencies, with the government leaders. The second strand is around addressing the root causes to violence and extremism. The third is around our work in the Middle East, and mainly around the Middle East peace process. And finally, the fourth is looking at advanced countries, developed countries, and trying to find practical solutions to the challenges that globalization is increasingly causing in developed countries. I, of course, work in the first of those in developing countries, mainly in Africa. And as Dr. Pham mentioned, I head our practice for inclusive growth and private sector development. And the report that we're presenting today is largely putting forward the lessons that we have learned through our work in a number of governments in Africa, helping them with their visions and their approach to economic transformation and job creation. So largely what the report does is 3 things, basically, and that's what I'll talk through for the rest of my time. Firstly is we try to explain why the general approach to private sector development over the past number of decades actually is an important approach, but it's not quite sufficient in terms of the needs on the ground. And secondly, we put forward a suggestion for what we think is also needed on top, which is what we call market-based sector development, or a type of modern industrial policy, effectively. And finally, we go into sort of suggesting how to go about doing this. So starting at the top, the recent approach to private sector development and inclusive growth in Africa has largely been what we call the generic enabling environment approach. And this is doing a number of reasonable things, openness to trade, trying to set up a level playing field, putting in generic infrastructure, a stable macroeconomic environment, to doing business indicators, etc. But when we look at on the ground, the structural changes that are needed to create the number of jobs that are increasingly being needed. And by jobs, I'm not just talking about formal jobs, but basically livelihoods, economic livelihoods. So that includes farmers and vendors and so on. Those structural changes are not happening, and they're not happening in a way that's creating enough jobs in many countries in Africa. And therefore, what we call the jobs gap is increasing because the population is set to double in the next by 2050, and then double again after that. So this is an important topic, and it's important for us to understand, how we can help countries in Africa, in particular, to start to create more economic opportunities. So the starting point for us was to look at what are the problems of the generic enabling environment approach. What can we learn so that we can find better solutions? And we find sort of that there are 5 main problems, and sort of the literature also points to some of these. The first is it kind of generally assumes that different firms and different sectors face the same types of constraints, when actually there are very different binding constraints faced by different companies and different sectors. Whether if you're a tourism company, your constraints and your challenges are different to if you're a poultry firm or a textile firm. Secondly, it also assumes that institutions are either already fully capacitated or fully strong, which is often not quite the case, or it assumes that you first build institutions, you build capacity, and then that allows you then to set an enabling environment, which then allows the private sector to come along. But it doesn't quite work like that. In effect, institutions are sort of a factor of the existing economic structure already. And so effectively, the issue is that it kind of ignores the current economic structure and the political economy incentives that creates and brings about. And effectively, look at a number of countries in Africa. There are three types of private sector that tend to have the most money. And having money is important because as a politician, if you are the head of a ministry, if you are a minister, to succeed, you need support, and you need money as well to run your campaign, etc. And the types of businesses that tend to have the money tend to be either importers or extractors or monopolies or oligopolies. So the asks that they give to governments, to politicians in return for their support, don't tend to be the things that are necessary to set an enabling environment. They tend to be either tax incentives or preferential licenses, typically. I mean, many other things, but those tend to really stand out. And so for you to succeed as a politician, those are the types of audiences you need to respond to. The fourth problem is that governments are doomed to choose anyway, and there are papers on this by people like Land Pritchett and others, right? In where I came from just now, Liberia, this year they're able to build one road in a whole year because that's what the budget allows. So which road is it going to be? You have to choose. Are you going this way or are you going that way? And that makes a difference. And finally, this generic approach doesn't really provide a basis for coordination, and mainly coordination with government. I mean, the number one factor for private sector tends to be policy coherence. They want to have some consistency around which to put in there to make their decisions. But without having a benchmark, it's difficult for the various agencies and ministries of government, typically up to 15 or 20 of them, that shape that enabling environment, for them to coordinate and coalesce around. So how do we get the economic transformation that we need? What we think we need is market-based sector development. You take a sector where you have a comparative advantage, and that can create jobs at scale, does well on the product space, all of those things, and you focus on it and you set that as a strategic goal. But you also seek to develop it in a politically smart way as well, by building political constituencies for reform in that sector. And then you apply what the Harvard guys would call PDIA, problem-driven iterative adaptation, where you take the biggest constraint, you focus on that, you fix it, and then you move on. So you focus on fixing the biggest binding constraints specific to those sectors that have the biggest requirements, or the biggest potential, I should say. The problem is that this is not being applied well in Africa. There are some cases where it is, but they are very few and far between. And actually, in most countries in Africa, this is not yet being applied well enough, or to the extent that is necessary from a job creation perspective. We recognize it's difficult, but there are some things that can be improved upon. First of all, we think that fundamentally, it has to be driven by the center of government. It can't be driven by, that's not a thing for the Ministry of Trade and Industry, or the Ministry of Agriculture, or the Ministry of Tourism. They have an important role to play. But the driving force has to be the head of state and the Ministry of Finance, typically with it, because they have the power and the clout to bring all these other agencies that play a role, the Revenue Authority, the Ministry of Labor, the Ministry of Energy, etc., to come around and coalesce around one vision. And that's typically been missing. A second thing is, another thing that can be improved upon is the counter incentives, understanding the political economy in a better way. I was in Liberia, there was a program working on cocoa, trying to develop the cocoa sector. But the whole time it was working with the Ministry of Agriculture to put in a regulatory framework to attract the right investment that would improve yields, etc. But there were people in the Ministry of Agriculture that had no interest in that, because they were their partners were the people that benefited from the status quo. And the project wasn't set up in a way to overcome that barrier. So that in the end led to a failure to put in a regulatory framework. Another key thing, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Whack-A-Mole, which is this arcade game where the moles keep coming up faster and faster, and you have to whack them as fast as you can. Eventually, you just cannot keep up. That's effectively what an economic advisor recently told me it's like to be a president. You just cannot keep up with the crises, the demands, the pressures on a day-to-day basis, and the ones you faced yesterday are different to what you face today. So we have not really understood this properly and put in the right type of implementation support to political and business leaders, I should say, on top of that, to succeed. And finally, governments are also pulled apart by uncoordinated projects. And it's important for us to recognize this because, in our work at the center of government, we do see how you end up with, your Ministry of Agriculture, for example, because you don't get typically the money you need for programs, you don't get from the central budget. It's too low for that in many countries in Africa. So you have to get your programs funded through development partners. So ministries of agriculture do tend to respond more to the Rome-based agencies on food security. Ministries of trade tend to respond more to the Geneva-based agencies. The investment agency might be responding to some analysis done by the IFC or Investment Climate Agency. Ministry of Finance, they're responding mainly to the IMF. That's their main sort of partner, I should say, and they tend to look at the sectors that are already creating more revenues. And then you have the private sector lobbies on top of this. So in many cases, what's happening, it's difficult to see this, but from our perspective, we're lucky enough to see it. Many governments are ended up being pulled apart in different directions, and governments struggle to therefore function as a coherent unit, setting the right enabling environment for the private sector. So the report suggests 4 things, basically, to get right, to address this. First of all, it's starting from the government's own vision, and by government, that's sort of largely the political elite and the business elite, really understanding what is it their vision for developing their economy, challenging that, working with them, and helping understand what are the sectors that can actually develop, that can actually work and deliver enough jobs. So getting the economics right, but also getting the politics right, as well as understanding the political dynamics and building constituencies for reform by building especially the domestic private sector, not just foreign, but domestic private sector in the sectors that require stronger institutions and a better enabling environment. So that is a key component. And then putting in a structure to help this. Coordination is important, primarily within government. So first of all, we need to make sure that governments have the ability to coordinate amongst themselves. That comes first, so that government can take a lead in developing market systems and playing its role in the systems. And then coordination with the private sector itself, of course, and development partners. And finally, we call for an embedded delivery team. And this is not necessarily about necessarily a delivery unit, but it's about an implementation machinery that's fit for purpose. So if your goal is development of the tourism sector or the cocoa sector or the textile sector, is having a machinery in the center of government and with your ministries of trade, etc., that's dedicated to that task and the task that the vision that the head of state and the cabinet have. And these implementation machineries that can then work with the existing systems in finance, etc., these machineries are typically missing. And we've seen a number of examples of where various bits of these have worked well, and they're mentioned in the report. And let me conclude with this, is to answer the question, what is it that development partners specifically can do to help? And I think the main thing is to start to do things quite differently by making sure we're helping governments play their role in market systems. We all recognize the importance of market systems and value chains, but really trying to help governments play its own role, given the complexities of government and the limited capacity of how governments work, is really important. And this requires a number of things. Seeing things more from the government's perspective, like what's their own vision? The many bright, smart, really driven and passionate people in many governments in Africa that really want to do what's best for their country. Yes, they might need some technical support or some managerial support, most importantly. So let's give it to them, but let's it be their own vision, because that's what will lead to lasting change and development. So we invest in the right capacity behind this, and mainly it's 2 capacities. It's strategic. How do you navigate the realities of the politics on the ground? That's what matters at the end of the day, is domestic politics to you as a minister of whatever. And implementation support with that. How do you align resources? How do you start to get the programs in that will get you political traction that you need to continue delivery? So support local reformers in government and in the private sector too, in the job-creating private sector, to succeed, basically, and to navigate their politics and to succeed. And this is something that we see too little of, it must be said. So help governments get coordinated and take the lead, coordinate these job-creating value chains, and then also target the right investors to build political constituencies for reform. So our investment promotion should be targeting those investors that will, inherent in their business model, not for a CSR perspective or anything else, require a stronger standards agency, will require a stronger Ministry of Labor, for example. This is what can drive lasting change, because you have the constituency for reform right there on the ground. And the last thing I will say is, to do this, we need to set appropriate expectations as well. We can't have 5-year projects expecting economic transformation. What we do need is a 20-year, 30-year vision, and then 5-year projects which are commensurate to that, starting on where the country itself is on its development curve. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you. You can come back and join us here on the panel. And thank you, all of you, for taking time this afternoon to have this important conversation. As Dr. Pham said earlier, my name is Aubrey Hruby, and I am here in part at the Atlantic Council because we all share a real concern over job creation, the future of job creation in Africa. So I want to turn to Helen on my left to say a little bit about what you think the answer is for job creation challenge in Africa. You've spoken at it at length, and kind of what the experience of China has to do with the way forward for African markets.
Thank you, Aubrey. First, I want to talk about economic transformation. Who are the countries who are able to did it in the past? So if we're looking at the history from 1950 to 2008, in our human history in those times, there's about 200 developing economies globally. But in reality, only 2 economies moved from lower income status to higher income status. That is South Korea and Taiwan. China likely to be the 3rd one by 2025. And out of those 200 developing economies, only 13 of them moved from middle income status to higher income status. Out of those 13, 8 of them are in Europe. The original GDP gap is small. The other 5 are the Asia 4 tigers, plus Japan. So actually, let's look at Africa. It's very well known in the 50s, in the global development community, Africa has a much better chance for economic transformation because of the natural resources. Asia is a hopeless continent. But in our human history in those years, what happened? Clearly, we've just shared the result. So what went wrong? I would say first about the model of development, the way of thinking things. What is Asia's success? I would say 2 things. Number 1, job creation. It is the key for poverty reduction. I was born in 1978. The GDP per capita in China is only $154 US, the year I was born, which is less than 1/3 of the sub-Saharan African countries. In my generation, I witnessed 680 million people has been lifted out the international poverty line in China. And according to World Bank, the number of people living under the international poverty line since year 1960 in the world didn't decline if I exclude those 680 million people in China. And the second thing, most importantly, for those poor countries, how did they start the first economic transformation? All those countries, they were able to do it because in the 60s and 80s, they were able to capture this golden opportunity during reshaping of global value chain. They were able to create millions of jobs for the people in the bottom of the pyramid. And that is the jump start of those countries' economic transformation.
And they did it through manufacturing. Light manufacturing in particular.
Exactly, because there has been a lot of leapfrogging models have been telling Africa, this can creating jobs. But in reality, any of those one works, as I shared with you. In our human history in those 70 years, none of those models worked. And I shared with you another model about this development thinking, the path you take. India and China, the GDP per capita in India back in 1978, at that time, India is 20% higher than China, the GDP per capita. Guess today, what's the difference between the 2 countries? At that time, those are huge countries in Asia. They all have huge populations. Today, the GDP per capita in China is 5 times more than India. Why? I would tell you, Actually, those two countries choose two different paths of development. India chooses a development path which is service-based driven. China is chosen an industrialization-based development path, and that is driving those two countries' result as what we are seeing today.
And so it brings me, because in this report, Jonathan, you guys talk a lot about what you would call a modern industrial strategy and the need for African countries to have a modern industrial strategy. What do you mean by that? And Helen, maybe you can also join in that conversation, because country you've worked in often is Ethiopia, and Ethiopia of any country seems to have a modern industrial strategy. So what do you see as a modern industrial strategy? And how can other countries kind of follow down the path?
Sure. Well, that's a very good question. I think the first thing to say, there's two things in there. The first thing is the word modern, and then the second is industrial strategy. By modern, I think, taking a leaf out of Danny Roderick's book, it's basically saying it's basically trade-oriented, so largely export-oriented. It's not about import substitution of the 70s and so on. It's definitely not that. It is about facing the global economy, embracing it, and finding what you're good at. And the second bit is the industrial strategy. Again, it's not necessarily industry in the sense of manufacturing. Manufacturing could be it, but it's basically taking any sector that where you can compete internationally, can bring revenues in and create the jobs, and focusing on developing it. So that's why in the reports we talk about sector development. Those sectors can be manufacturing, where you have if you have a comparative advantage in manufacturing, as in Ethiopia.
So like a
it could be
cluster, a competitive cluster kind of.
Competitive cluster. It could be cocoa. It could be the creative industries. It could be, it could be movies or whatever it is. It could be tourism. But where you have a basis for comparative advantage. The other thing to mention is that you should have a strong basis for comparative advantage because of the opportunity cost. Because I've seen cases where every country in Africa wants to develop tourism, for example, but not every country in Africa has a comparative advantage in tourism. And you could be losing lots of time. You could be investing in cocoa and starting to get much more traction, right, but you're losing time on tourism where you can only maybe create 1,000 or 2,000 jobs at best. So also getting the right sector is really important.
Yeah.
I would say actually today we talk about modern industrialization strategy, but sometimes we forgot. Actually 6 or 7 years ago, that's actually a forbidden word even in DC. When Professor Justin Lin, being the first chief economist of the World Bank, he talking about new structural economics. He talked about industrialization strategy. A lot of his colleagues doesn't believe him. I mean, actually, when he became the first chief economist from developing country, in 2009 he started to saying, after 30 years golden manufacturing, China about to relocate 85 million jobs. Because in the 60s, Japan only relocating 9.7. In the 80s, Korea only relocating 2.3 million. This time, 85 million. As a global development community, we need to help Africa to be able to capture this golden opportunity. That's why we need industrialization strategy. But at that time, nobody believed it. I'm so glad people today. But then I've been through in on this journey. How did people change their thought? I would say actually Ethiopia should be a very important country. How the story started. When Justin started pushing this at 2009, very few people believed him. But one person, I think this person should be named in the history, is the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Meles. Meles believed him, and Meles asked Justin, in 2011 when they met, he asked him, how am I going to do it? Tell me the how. So Justin told him, in order to do it, you need to create a quick, successful examples, because that's the best way to bring inspiration, leadership, confidence, and experience to your country, to the continent. The Prime Minister believed him. Personally, he went into China 6 months later, invited a group of manufacturers, and I was among them. And actually, I set up the first shoe factory in Ethiopia, for the company Huajian. It took us 3 months from deciding investment to actual production from Ethiopia to the US market. In the following 6 months, the company will double the export revenue in Ethiopia in the shoe sector. By the end of year 1, we recruited 2,000 local workers. By the end of year 2, we recruited 4,000 local workers. People don't believe me today. People are talking about industrialization. But I remember when I put my feet into the country, very, very few people believe this is going to work. They're still talking about doing business report. They're talking about let's fulfill all those enablers. But the question is, when you fulfill all those enablers, probably take another 100 years. And this golden opportunity out of 85 million is not going to be there anymore. So I think it's very important that, Aubrey, you know my story about this riding the tiger. I think it's important for the development community to think, actually, are you still spending too much talking? Are you actually really going to do it? I had an education I did my executive MBA from INSEAD. If you ask me to compare the Western entrepreneurship and Chinese entrepreneurship, I always say the following. If you have a tiger in front of you, what I've learned from the West, when you see that tiger, get your laptop, study carefully the characteristic of the tiger, and then discuss with colleagues, what's the problem with the tiger, how we are going to conquer it. The problem, when you finish out that study, the tiger might be gone, or you are being eaten by the tiger. The Chinese entrepreneurship is very different. They have a tiger in front of them, they jump on top of the tiger and they're riding it. And now actually, I think Chinese are riding the tiger in Africa. So it's very important actually for this part of the world to figure out what is their strategy going forward.
Yeah. Anabel, I want to bring you in the conversation because we are seeing, and the report brings it out, but also what Jonathan and Helen just said, this maybe, I don't want to say tension, but a different approach of maybe the World Bank's traditional kind of doing business indicators and things that affect all businesses in the country, and targeted sectoral strategies. And how do you see it? Are those in conflict? Do you see them as sapping resources two different ways? Or what's your view of kind of this modern industrial policy gap?
So thank you very much, Aubrey, for having me here, and congratulations to Jonathan and the authors of the report for bringing in, I think, a very pragmatic perspective. And if I may, I'd like to say a couple of things first on the report, and actually tackle your question while I do this. The first point is that there are a number of things that I like about the report. First, I think it focuses on the process, on the how, which in particular, how to develop government capabilities in developing countries to be able to implement interventions that are feasible. And having worked at a government myself, I know that some of those challenges are present not only in African countries, but in many other countries as well. So that is, I think, one good thing that I like about the report. And I also like about the report that it, while discussing the what, and Jonathan was just doing that here, yes, manufacturing may be an opportunity, and certainly for a country like Ethiopia, I think it does make a lot of sense. But there are other sectors that are as relevant for other countries as agribusiness, tourism, and others. So that's one point that I like. Second point that I like is that the report is humble in two ways. First, it recognizes the importance of sectoral strategies as a complement to the broader enabling environment. Okay. And I think that this is the key. I do think that I don't think that it's one or the other, because depending on the country's circumstances, you may need the doing business types of reforms for many reasons.
Rwanda comes to mind. I mean, they've done incredible things in terms of going up on the business indicators, but also have sectoral strategies.
Yeah, so no, exactly. And I think that is the case actually for most countries, because you may well be, in the position number 180 in the doing business, and that is sending a signal that is not a very good signal to potential investors. So you want to keep those two in mind, and also the point made that it is a learning and adaptive process that needs to take place. I also find that relevant. Another point that I find very relevant is that it discusses the political economy, and I think that is very relevant for any reform, be it the enabling environment reform or be it the sectorial reform. Now, I have a couple of questions that I'd like to also pose and refer to, which is, we know that there's no one thing as the African continent. There's a lot of diversity. So one question that I had in reading the report is, have you thought about whether the approach that is being recommended may have some nuances depending on the type of countries, in particular natural resource-driven countries or fragile and conflict states? The other point that I think is relevant is looking at some of the the promising sectors, as the report mentions. And I think Jonathan made the point here that you're looking at sectors that can create jobs, and also sectors that have the potential of actually competing either globally or in very large domestic products that is subject to competition. So that in itself, if you look at those two elements, tend to highlight some kind of horizontal policies that are probably going to be relevant in most countries, including policies to strengthen skills, policies to foster access to inputs, more competitive services sectors, access to markets, and others. So there's also an agenda that in parallel is actually evolving as we speak of sectors. The other point that I wanted to mention, or more of a question, is what about spatial policies? The success that some of these African countries have had have been related to the establishment of special economic zones or economic corridors. So that's, I think, another point. Okay. And last but not least, I also wanted to make one point, or 2 points actually. One is it important to have a look at an issue, for instance, of women? Because when you think about jobs, there's clearly also a gender agenda there. And there are some cross-cutting constraints that women face, irrespective of the sector, that relate to inequality in the household, outside of the household, inequality of opportunity. So we may want to look at that. And the final point that I wanted to make relates to the urgency of adopting an approach like this. Because I think some of the work that Helen described and some of the work that she's been doing in Africa is great. But I think there's a certain sense of urgency in that work. We recently issued at the World Bank Group a report that is called Trouble in the Making, the Future of Manufacturing-Led Development. Yeah. And we asked, is this feasible?
How big is the window?
Is it feasible in going forward? And so my final point is, this aligns well with the thinking at the bank right now. We've just developed a new diagnostic called the Country Private Sector Diagnostics in conjunction with IFC to be able to identify sectors where they are feasible, desirable, and where interventions are feasible for investments from the private sector to come in.
Sure. Well, thank you, Anabel. You make my job as a moderator much easier coming up with so many questions for our panel here. Let me divide it up this way and to continue the conversation. I don't believe either one of you believe that all countries are going to develop the same, or that they're all going to have manufacturing hubs, et cetera. So Jonathan, maybe you can speak a little bit to the difference in countries. The ones you've worked in, Liberia is very different than Ethiopia. And Helen, maybe you can speak to the last point about the urgency. These 85 million jobs that are going to go, how big is the window before 3D manufacturing takes over and we don't see the light manufacturing jobs that we would see? So maybe we can speak that way. We'll start with you, Jonathan.
Yeah, I think, it's a really important point about the nuances across various countries. They're all different economies with different characteristics, geographic characteristics, size, population, and most importantly also political and institutional differences as well, and social differences as part of that. So I think it is very much about the country being able to find its own path and find out what it's good at, right? It's sort of the
So what do you see?
discovery.
Let's be specific, because I think panels often exist at some 30,000 foot. So what do you think in terms of sectors that Liberia will be long-term competitive? Which ones are they focusing on? And
sure.
Why do you speak to a couple of the countries
Sure.
and how they're doing it differently?
So Liberia and Sierra Leone, which is kind of similar there, we've sort of been working across different ministries to identify and answer this question. And there it's largely about the tree crops, for example. So cocoa, rubber, palm oil have huge potential, and they have opportunities they can exploit there. They have potential for downstream products, because those give you that window
Soap
going down the
yeah.
road. Yeah, the soaps, the cooking oil, and they start to get you into sort of an agribusiness. They can link up to plastics and packaging and really start to get you into agribusiness, as agri-processing and light manufacturing as well. Other countries might be more focused on tourism, or they might already have a basis for tourism. Malawi, where I was before, they've got great potential in areas like soya, as does Zambia next door. They also got potential in sugar. So there are there are differences in terms of sector, but you need to have, there needs to be a business case, a case for for people to make money, and also to build that sort of that can then give you the political capital.
Sure.
But in terms of sectors, it can sort of vary. We were talking about Nigeria earlier. Nigeria's got a very strong movie and creative industry. So sort of building that out sort of is really valuable.
I think it's an important point, though, that like even though we're talking a lot about manufacturing here, the job gap is so great and the challenge so great that it's got to be an and situation, whereby we're looking at creative industries in Nigeria for job creation. We're looking at manufacturing in Ethiopia. We're looking at agribusiness in some countries, because I don't believe that everyone will have the luxury of geography and time to market that will allow for manufacturing in the same way. Many of the countries are landlocked. 33% of Africans live in landlocked countries, where the global average is 3% of people living in landlocked countries.
Can I contribute? Actually, if Nigeria can develop by creating the industry you just mentioned, I think that will be the first in our human history they are able to develop their economy by that leapfrogging. Because as I mentioned, in our human history, no country was able to do it. The country they were able to did it, the country I just mentioned, they all actually started light manufacturing, because that's actually the scale you can create huge millions of jobs, globally. So that is one thing I think. A lot of the leapfrogging models, the sectors, it's very nice to talk about it, but it's also important to look detail how much actually jobs it can create it. And really looking about, the 15 million jobs you are talking about, the gaps. Are they really fitting together, or is it just a nice story to tell?
Should we, and speaking of that, Helen, let's go into the question of urgency and how, fourth industrial revolution may be preventing this strategy. Or what's your view of it? And then secondly, the role of industrial zones.
Sure. I think that's a very great thing you're talking about, urgency, because 2 years ago I've been working with World Economic Forum, because if all the robots going to replace all the workers in the factory, what I'm talking about, what happened in the history won't work again. But what I've learned are two things. Number one, the current jobs, the current machinery in the fourth revolution has already been developed. It's actually not to replace jobs in the labor-intensive industry. It's to replace in the service industry. Why? Economically, it makes sense. The cost of making a robot, it makes sense to replace accountant, lawyers in the service industry. Economically, it doesn't make sense to replace the workers actually in the factory, because that's still cheaper today. But that gap, how long will it take? We're talking about maximum probably not 5, probably 10, 15 years. So in my opinion, actually, 2015, United Nations launched this, like the Sustainable Development Goal, and which is talking about leave no one behind. If I'm thinking about the global GDPs, in the 60s, Europe and US are high, and Asia was down there. Japan first catching it up, and then Asia for tiger, and also China. But Africa has been trapped. I think this is the last window they can take the common comparative advantage as a poor country, which is competitive labor, to start it catching up. Because all those countries, they were able to catch up. They all taking the advantage. The countries who are not able to catch up, clearly, I think, actually, they are going to be trapped in poverty, because then this window actually of their comparative advantage actually is missing out in 10 years' time.
And it switches from the advantaging labor to advantaging capital, which then reverts growth back to developed markets and capital-rich markets.
Absolutely. That's why I think our generation really are facing the opportunity of that 1.2 billion population of Africans. Most of them are young people. In my opinion, it's not only Africa's problem. Why? Because let's look at the refugee crisis currently in Europe. Thinking about under the current development strategy, which is focused on health education, most of the young Africans with good health, a little bit education, in the next 10 years, not enough jobs. What is going to happen? They're going to fly to Europe. It's going to be a security issue, first in Europe and then rest of the world. So it's actually a lot of leaders, they have to make a decision. Are they going to let the generation have new opportunity, creating enough jobs for them in the continent? Or actually, are you going to let those youths become the bodies in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea?
And Anabel, what is the thinking? I mean, you said you said this recent report on kind of the changing manufacturing. I mean, does your view dovetail with what Helen is saying here, and do you believe that there could be diversified job creation models that generate the millions of jobs at scale needed?
Let me start with the second question to say that I do think that different sectors create different opportunities in different countries. And I do think that for some countries, it's going to be more the agribusiness. For others, it's going to be the tourism. For others, it will be manufacturing. And as you say, at the end of the day, it's an and. I mean, that's the only way in which you can really get to the job creation that you need. Now, going to your first question, I think that, a very fundamental question is, why do we think manufacturing is important? And I think, overall, you can basically say because manufacturing has been able to deliver, on the one hand, jobs for low-skilled population, and on the other,
often women.
Often women, certainly. In a place like Cambodia, for instance, 85% of the jobs in the apparel sector are women. So clearly very empowering for women. But also because it has driven productivity growth, and that is very relevant. Now, the question now is, in light of the new technologies, will manufacturing be able to deliver on both jobs and productivity? So, what we look at in the report is that there's not one single, manufacturing sector. There are different sectors. Some of them produced for regional markets, some of them produced for global markets. So when you look at this, you see that there are still opportunities for the manufacturing sector to be a driver of growth. But the bar in terms of being able to attract investors in the manufacturing sector is rising. It's not only going to be lower labor costs that will drive manufacturing decisions, but actually the capacity to absorb the new technology, to incorporate that new technology into the manufacturing process will become increasingly relevant.
And the productivity problem is one that's held back agribusiness in Africa, because African farmers are the least productive in the world, and that's been a challenge in agribusiness in particular. I do want to have Helen comment on the industrial zones, and then I want to before that ask you on where is job creation in the informal sector, because I have a strong belief that if you look at the data from the last 5 years, 10 years of African growth, a lot of the jobs that have been created in the informal sector. And if you look at the rebasing of Nigerian GDP, what you saw was a great growth of the service industry, and service industry was a giant catch-all for even the informal sector. So how do you make the informal sector more productive and capture more value? So can we speak to that, speak to industrial zones, and everyone start thinking of your questions, because I'll turn to the audience next.
I think that's a very important question, Aubrey. And I think the first point to be clear is that informality matters, and it matters for a number of reasons. It is a question of unprotected workers, both in terms of welfare, but it's also a question of equity and a question of efficiency. It also matters because it basically leads to low and distorted tax collection, and then the possibility of providing services. It also relates to the weak rule of law and whether the social contract is working or not. And it also impacts the issue of productivity. Now, it is not clear, I think, whether informality is a result of low incomes or actually are low incomes a result of informality. So in a way, it's important to work on both agendas at the same time, on policies that improve informality and productivity as well. So here, some things that are important include removing segment distortions in the labor market, and also reducing the cost of formal labor. Because it is not, the answer is not really to say, let's make informal firms or workers formal. It's actually, what are the incentives for that to happen? And then also, in doing that, are you actually supporting those moving to formality to actually become more productive?
Well, and that's where I'm very optimistic about a lot of the actually technologies and leapfrogging, if you will, is when they're applied to informality and formalizing the informal sector, they reduce the costs of becoming formal.
Correct.
And you see that, for example, in Nigeria with a firm called Cars 45, they're working with local car dealers who are just doing 4 or 5 cars, selling in their neighborhoods, all informal. But now they're putting them on a platform, they're helping them get credit, like all of that, so that they can do multiple times over their revenue per month. And so in that, they're not displacing the political economy that was there in the informal sector. They're actually just formalizing it and making it more productive. So maybe that's where some of the technology, when we say that apps don't create jobs, that's true, but they can make the informal sector more easily turn formal.
That's a very good point. I think that every measure that makes it, easier for the informal to become formal, but also to become more productive at the same time, is where the beauty of the policies lie, and we need to be thinking about that, particularly in a place like Africa where informality is so high.
Yeah. And maybe, Helen, can we have you comment on the industrial zones, their role, and how you see the informal sector? So in your experience, what did China do about the large informal sector? And can it be a job creator? And then we'll turn to questions from the audience.
Sure. I think if talking about this is the question about how to make industrialization happen. Is it just you can just take what China have and put in Africa, make it work? No. Actually, the whole journey China did it is a learning by doing. There's a famous saying, our leader once said, whether it's a black cat or a white cat, as long as you catch the mouse, it's a good cat. But I think actually a lot of policymakers, they're keeping a lot of time debating, should we take a black cat or should we take a white cat? They forgot the most important thing. And industrial zone basically is a place without changing the whole policy, without changing the whole structure of the country, you're actually testing what would work for you. So talking about my personal experience in Ethiopia, from that shoe factory, in 2013, I'm being asked by the Prime Minister to become the first Chinese advisor to work with the government. So how to snowballing from one factory to more? What happened is actually my first task as the advisor working with the government back in 2013 is to promote the first government-owned industrial zone. But previously I take on that job, they struggled 5 years to attract international manufacturers become a resident. How did I do it? With less than 3 months, without any international advertisement, all 22 factory units, all leased out to international manufacturers from India, Turkey, Bangladesh, China, all worldwide. Consider only 8 of the units are being built, 14 of them are on the plan. How did we do it? I invited the investor in. I showed them the 4,000 jobs I've created. Most importantly, I was able to show them the profit and loss account, telling them how the money is being made. They just signed the lease immediately. Success brings success. People spending too much talking about, cats. They need to say, if you can catch one mouse, what's the secret? How to actually replicating this? And that is because that success made World Bank in 2013 committed 200 million to Ethiopia to build more industrial zones. And then I set up the Made in Africa initiative, where I've been working with the government, building more industrial zones. The latest industrial zone in Ethiopia this year,
and
called Havasa.
Why do you believe industrial zones are key to industrialization? Why does it have to be done in an industrial zone structure?
As I said, it's very difficult. If you think you just find a set of policy, a sector, a model could just suddenly, with an advisor doing some report giving to the government saying this will work. It doesn't work like that way. I tell you, why back in 2013, why I took the Ethiopian ministers to China, seeing Shenzhen, they said, Helen, this is amazing. But you know what? The problem is, how am I getting from where I am today to there, the how? I've got a lot of nice report, but they're collecting dust in my office. And then some people doing some, incentives, and we say there, expect the investor come. They didn't come, so the problem is how. And then what I did, actually, I find the people who made the industrial zone in China, people who are in their late 50s, those people are really doers. They set up the first policy. They have been sharing how to concretely make the first step. It's a whole learning by doing process. If you ask the Ethiopian government, there's a whole learning journey they went through in the past 6 years. They didn't figure out, at 6 years ago. It's a journey you have to went through. And industrial park, actually, it's a designated area. You started learning, you started testing what works for you. And then if it works, you can start it snowballing.
And that can be the focus of this modern industrial policy that Jonathan's talked about. Well, let's take a few questions from the audience, and then we'll continue this conversation. Ambassador here. I'll take 3 at one time, and then we'll come back. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Carlos dos Santos. I'm the ambassador of Mozambique to the U.S. I wanted to start by thanking the Atlantic Council to hold yet another discussion on Africa. We don't take it for granted in Washington, D.C., and we find these discussions very informative and very useful. And I also welcome Tony Blair Center. I was ambassador or High Commissioner to the UK before I came here, and I did visit the center a number of times, and the center has been helping Mozambique with the vision and strategies. The first observation I would like to make is for the future, I would recommend the Atlantic Council to have in the panel with these brilliant minds some Africans.
Yes.
Have one ambassador,
Yep.
one African academic, one businessman. We have many residents here in DC. I think you would have a richer
I
debate.
appreciate it.
I'm not underestimating the greatness of this debate. I have taken a lot of notes, and I think it has been good. I'm just suggesting that we would benefit even more if we had that. The next observation I wanted to make is that the report focuses on job creation. This is a challenge for all societies beyond Africa.
Ours here, too.
Exactly. So that means you have to talk about the strategies for the entire economy of Africa. And my suggestion here is that whenever we talk about those and we want to advise Africans, we have to look at what they are thinking, what is their vision. I didn't see any reference, I just looked at it. Maybe there are references to the Agenda 2063 of the African Union, and also the UN Global Compact, which brings in the private sector. I think this is important, although these are grand strategies, and you are discussing now the very much country strategies. It is important to look at those and try to see how you can bring them to the country level. I think we need to internalize them. On China, it is really refreshing to hear the remarks by Helen, because here and elsewhere in the Western world, we only hear about the negative aspects of China in Africa. And African governments are told, beware of China, you will have trouble in the future. And it's important to hear this perspective. And I wanted to ask the question about how do we take advantage of the opportunity of the 85 million jobs that China will relocate. Okay. One point made by Jonathan is about investors, choosing investors. Unfortunately, Africa doesn't have that luxury. Investors choose countries in Africa, and it may be challenging to do so. I would like to see how we can do it better, if that is possible. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. We appreciate your insights and remarks. Can we take right here behind as well? We'll come back to the panel in just a moment with your questions.
Hi, my name is Mary Francis. I work for the International Bureau at the U.S. Department of Labor. So you can see where I'm coming from. We work a lot with enforcing the labor eligibility criteria of trade preference programs in Africa, and we work with U.S. industry to try and integrate labor standards into trade and investment policy. So my question's for Mr. Said. You are talking about job creation as if job creation itself is the solution for inclusive economic growth, and of course understanding the need to create a lot of jobs very quickly. But I would caution against using the assumption that jobs will create inclusive economic growth. Research shows that unless the jobs created provide decent work opportunities with fair wages and safe working conditions, job growth can actually perpetuate disparities and help perpetuate a cycle of poverty. So I'd like to hear how your organization is taking into account the working conditions or the quality of jobs that you're creating. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, along those same lines, hearing what Ms. Hai has to say about the GDP comparison in India and China, noting that both of those have had incredible GDP growth, but there's also incredible economic disparity, or income disparity, excuse me. So I'm just wondering, you know, how do we learn from those countries' best practices while working to further to better ensure that the growth in Africa is more inclusive?
Okay, great. Do we have any other questions? We have one over here from Coleman.
Thank you all for your time. My name is Kwame Sompempong. I manage the Africa Business Fellowship, where we send talented American business people to go work in various African markets. I'm curious in your thoughts about kind of my observation is what seems to be a disjoint in what's happening currently in kind of developments in technology versus kind of foundational things that need to happen on the African continent. So increasingly I feel stressed, with kind of Ray Kurzweil saying in 2045 artificial technology is going to run away, it'll self-improve, whereas we'll have a world where Bitcoin, blockchain is running things, yet say the power sector on the continent can't handle that kind of activity. I'm wondering, like, how do you reconcile those things in terms of trying to be opportunistic, but perhaps not being quite there yet to be opportunistic in kind of day-to-day, real-time implementation.
Sure. Do we have any one last question in this round? Well, let's go here, and then we'll take the next one.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. To what extent are you able to use the internet to get the people together for meetings and putting up the funding and getting some transparency?
Okay. Well, it sounds an interesting group of questions. Maybe I'll start with the ambassador's kind of take there. I do believe that, to your point about investors choose the countries, I do believe African countries have more choice of partners than they have had in a very long time, meaning Indians are investing in Africa, Turkish companies are investing in Africa, Malaysians were the biggest investor 3 years ago, you have Moroccans investing south into sub-Saharan markets, and South Africans investing north. So in a way, and Jonathan and I talked about this in the op-ed we published, there are a greater choice of partners. That doesn't mean always that you get the investor themselves that you want, but you can choose among countries that bring different competitive advantages for investors. So, if you are doing rail, it's probably better to talk to the Chinese about railroads than it is the Americans. We don't build railroads in our own country. So, there is partnerships, I think, country by country, that you can kind of instruct. But Jonathan, I'll let you discuss a little bit of that choice of investors, sure, investor promotion, and then Helen, if you want to take kind of the positive view of China plus how do you get that 85 million job window, and then we'll move to this technology, sure, question in a second.
Yeah, I think, you're absolutely right. That's unfortunately, investors have been choosing Africa. But I think that's exactly because we haven't had a sector focus. So many governments, many countries in Africa are not able to offer the product and that the investors that can create jobs actually want. So for example, I can talk a lot about Liberia because I've just lived there for a number of years. Many investors came and chose Liberia. They were mainly, the iron ore companies, etc., that's interested in extraction. But Liberia has lots of potential in cocoa, as an example. But because Liberia wasn't organized and didn't set cocoa as a strategic focus, it didn't do what it could have done. It could have gone and spoken to the cocoa companies across the border in Cote d'Ivoire who are sort of looking outside of Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana because the cocoa sector is saturated there. And so for them, Liberia was a black hole, but Liberia wasn't sort of putting the teams forward to sort of address their concerns and target the companies there. They could have been targeting Mars. They could have been targeting a number of industries to get start to bring them in, address their concerns. So I think if we have a sector focus and we're able to get the government coordinated and focus on those sectors, you can then identify the right countries to go to, for example, and know which companies are, would be interested in what you have to offer and really address their constraints. So that's a huge advantage of applying this sort of sector development approach rather than just being generic.
Yeah. And then let's have Helen on the kind of how do you get the 85 million jobs?
I think first, also connect to that question, what is Africa's real comparative advantage? You can say, okay, some countries, they have cocoa, they should develop the value chain into chocolate making industry. Then you need to ask yourself, how can Africa, those countries compete with Switzerland, and why those businesses in Switzerland want to move their already, chocolate production to Africa? Why? What's the business reason for them? Actually, it's very difficult because that's a capital intensive industry. You need to have all the infrastructure in order to attract them. But what I'm talking about, why these 85 million jobs work? Because the GDP per capita in China in 2015 is 7,500. And according to China's forecast, by 2025, China is going to double that. That is why by 2025, China is going to become a high-income country. All those 85 million jobs, whether China like it or not, those jobs have to go to other countries. That is the opportunity, why it is there. You can talk about, I think in this development community, we talk a lot of ideas. It's very nice, but it's too much idealism. You need to figure out what is the business reason for those businesses want to relocate. It's not just a single side thing. And what Ambassador talking about, today we're talking about shared global prosperity. How to get Africa into global value chain and taking more value added. And the path I've been talking about, as a poor country, we realize manufacturing, that's the best way actually for you enter in. And then when you develop a big scale, you actually can go into capital incentive, and now China moving it up.
So what do you think, if you had to tell countries, what are the 3 things they can do to be capturing some of that jobs, what would you tell them?
Number one, I think still going back to what I said, what path you take. If you're still talking about a lot of idealism path, it can take you there, it's your choice. But Asia has been demonstrating what's the path. So now I think Africa has a choice. You can listen what European telling you, what African telling you, what Chinese telling you. But at the end of the day, it's your own path. It's your own choice. So this is something I think African leaders need to understand themselves. And secondly, there is this 85 million jobs. And then when we talk about manufacturing, there's a lot of things, actually seem settled, but actually make a huge difference. Today, people can say, we should produce for the local market, but that's people understood. Today, Africa has only less than 3% of the global GDP. If you get all the road, regional connection connected, how much the market, how much job you can create? What actually all those countries in Asia, they decided to target overseas. So targeting this 85 million jobs, I would say actually there's also a role this part of the world you can play, which is changing product from made in China to made in Africa, putting Africa into global value chain. The most important thing now this round, AGOA has been there, existed for 10 years. Africa couldn't take advantage of it. Why? Because they don't have manufacturing know-how. And this round with 85 million jobs, China is the first time relocating that manufacturing know-how.
So meaning they bring some of their know-how as well when they invest.
Exactly. And I give you a very concrete example. I want to talk about this. We kept talking about capacity. Maybe I'm going to upset a lot of people about training. When I go to Ethiopia, I went to these Tibet schools. World Bank government spent millions of dollars in it. And they have this class teaching people how to make shoes. I sat in the class, but then afterwards, I spent 5 minutes with this teacher, and then I left. I didn't recruit any people. Do you know why? Because when I talked to this teacher, he's German, I asked him, how long have you spent on manufacturing floor? He said, actually, I didn't spend a single day on manufacturing floor. You ask some practitioner, great student he has trained, clearly not. Currently, when we talk about capacity building, in our current structure, it's a good idea. But when it comes down to implementation, they only measured on how many people they train. It's not measured on how many jobs that are being created. And there's a lot of pitfalls existing. This is actually, when we set up the first shoe factory, we trained the students and everybody worked for us. They can get at least 50% salary increase. And last thing I want to say, this spillover effect. In the 80s, when Bangladesh don't have any manufacturing, the first company, Daewoo, went there. They recruited 200 girls and training as the managers. 5 years later, all those 200 girls left. That's the beginning of the local garment production for Bangladesh. Yeah. Today, you are seeing thousands of them. That's the real, actually, spillover effect. When you bring the real players in the global market, they transform the skill. Those skills is not being taught in the class.
Yeah. So let me make sure we get to the quality jobs versus just job numbers. Jonathan, if you want to take that question about inclusive growth, and then we want to make sure we get this gap between the basic technology of like electricity and then what that's going on. So maybe Jonathan and then Anabel, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I think on the issue of quality jobs, I think I think it's fundamentally an issue of sequencing. To be frank, you kind of have to start somewhere, and you have to start by identifying what you're good at, what you're able to compete in a global economy, and start moving on that. Get the investors in that you can, in a way that works, where the economics works, where they're able to make, where there's a business case, and then move on from there. I think that is, unfortunately, I think is the harsh reality, is that there is a sequencing. We've seen with Bangladesh. Like with Bangladesh, the investment in the garment sector was very much at low standards, and that, of course, is not ideal. But had we gone in with high standards from the beginning, that might not have happened in the same way. And it's only once you actually start to get the industry, then you start to move up as you secure your capability and your competitiveness. It is unfortunate, but that is the reality. And I have seen cases where, unfortunately, we have tried to go into certain countries with certain labor standards as a prerequisite, and that has put off the investment, which could have led to. So we have to be careful there about the sequencing, and then once the capability grows, you then start to strengthen the capabilities.
I've had several African ministers tell me, before you can regulate jobs, you have to have jobs.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes the view.
Yeah.
And again, and maybe there's an important pushback here, but.
Yeah. But I think you also have to you definitely do have to look for quality jobs, but you have to start from where the country is now. And so, for example, if you're bringing jobs in at $5 an hour, $5 a day, that's a starting point for people that otherwise would have been earning, $1 a day, right? The reality is you have to start from that level and start to build up from there. Otherwise you might miss out.
Annabel, you want to comment on this, and maybe anyone who wants to comment on the technology question? How do you manage, obviously when China transitioned in the 80s, it was different in terms of what technologies were today, right? So how does the African countries make the leap into manufacturing, traditional manufacturing, while at the same time trying to become competitive in these kind of new technologies?
Well, I think this was a very important question, because it goes back to the point that the fundamentals are important as well. If you don't have energy, it's very difficult to do anything. So this is why some of the largest investments, for instance, of the World Bank Group are precisely in energy. Likewise in the case of roads, likewise in the case of logistics. And then it goes back also to the skills question, and then to the institutions. So yes, there are some of these things that are absolutely indispensable if you want to move forward with a number of these strategies. In terms of the new technologies, I think that we have seen that some African countries have been able to leapfrog on the use of some of those technologies. And I guess the example of mobile phones in a number of African countries, Kenya and others, is of course very relevant. But in order for that to happen, it is clear that you need to also have in place the infrastructure that allows for that. So, investments in some of this basic infrastructure are still very important and will continue to be very important for African countries.
And they're important for both the manufacturing side. I mean, Helen works a lot in making sure that there's infrastructure in place.
Yes, no, exactly.
And important for the technology side.
Absolutely. And for example, in the case of Ethiopia, I think it's great what Ethiopia has done in terms of, jump-starting, putting in place the special economic zones. But we're working with Ethiopia as well on a number of things, on developing their quality infrastructure for them to be able to upgrade in the global value chain. On the logistics, because it's great that they have the train to Djibouti. Yeah, but then you need to have the logistics in place. So we're working with them in terms of training an industrial workforce. How do you turn an agricultural subsistence farmer into an industrial worker? Working with them with the investment promotion agency to again upscale their capability. So yes, this is very important, but it needs to be sort of embedded in a vision, in a clear vision, thinking about how do you take this forward.
Yeah. Well, I would like to give Jonathan and Helen an opportunity for a last word, and then we'll close, make sure everyone gets out here on time.
Well, thank you very much for that. I think, the last parting thoughts I have would be around stressing this point about complementarity. I think, the experience that I've seen is that there was a message that was given in some cases, which was before you have the energy or before you have the roads, there's no private sector that would come, for example, which was a bit unfortunate, because actually in the meantime you could do a lot to start developing the basis for certain sectors, put the regulatory in place, system in place developing local SMEs as well. Yes, definitely, FDI is very important, but critically building local small and medium enterprises is really important because they will be the businesses in the future that can also give you the political constituencies you need. And really start to get your ducks in a row. So when the energy does come, and it might only come in 10 years' time because that's how long it takes, then you're really ready to exploit those opportunities. So the complementarity of the two is really important. As well as finally the stressing the point around the political economy. So let's really do much more to understand the political realities that the leaders on the ground face on a day-to-day basis. What is it that incentivizes them? What are the constraints? What are the things that demotivate them? There are many leaders that we've seen in Africa that have been demotivated from doing good things just because they're fighting the system on a day-to-day basis. And then us as development partners sometimes come in and make it more difficult for them because we're not seeing it from their perspective, but we're seeing, oh, this worked in this other country, therefore you should be doing this. So really having the flexibility of how we work with governments and with the businesses, businesses in the private sector itself, to sort of help them go through and help them succeed is really the key message that I would leave with.
Helen, any last thoughts before we close?
I would say prioritize. You know, development is the ocean of things. We can spend talking about many problems. But I think what is the top priority? This is the most critical question for a lot of leaders to understand. And now with this 85 million golden opportunity, are you also going to target it? This is a decision a lot of countries have to make. And then one of the things I want to say, you know, as development community, we can talk about what actually we think is right. But at the end of the day, it's the African government's choice. It's their journey. And now actually, as the Made in Africa initiative, you know, we are currently working with 8 countries. I never approach those head of states. They actually approach us, want us to work with them. Why? Because I think there's, whether we like it or not, there's an industrialization movement has already started. So it's important, I would say, if you ask me to the last word, I would say implementation, implementation, and implementation.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us for this conversation. A lot here, and we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aubrey. Thank you.
Thank you very much.